Welcome to Educational Alpha. I'm Bill Kelly, CEO of Chi Association, and your host, bringing you on-the-ground conversations with business leaders, educators, and industry colleagues from around the globe. Educational Alpha is sponsored by iCapital, the financial technology company with the mission to power the world's alternative investment marketplace. Part innovator, part educator, and part navigator of the alternatives industry, iCapital offers intuitive, scalable digital solutions that have transformed how private market and hedge fund investments are bought and sold. With iCapital, financial advisors, wealth managers, and asset managers around the world now have access to everything they need to deliver the return and diversification potential of alternatives to high net worth investors. To learn more, visit iCapital.com.
In this episode, Bill welcomes Michelle DiGruttolo, a seasoned intelligence professional with a 25-year career in Army intelligence and a former daily intelligence briefer for President Barack Obama. Michelle discusses her extensive background, offering insights into geopolitical risks and the evolution of security clearances. She also delves into the implications of current geopolitical dynamics, highlighting the shift from a unipolar to a multipolar world and the impact of global changes on security and investment strategies. Listen in.
Michelle DiGruttolo, welcome to Educational Alpha.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Very much looking forward to this. And it seems like every single day I pick up the newspaper, The Economist, and there's another geopolitical hotspot out there. And it looks like if we had a heat map of the world and maybe something you've dealt with in your prior life, it's probably as red hot as it ever has been. So this is interesting and timely for so many reasons. But before we get into that, you have a very, very interesting background. And we've spoken a little bit about it, but a lot of this will be discovery for me as well. And certainly thank you for your service. I think you served in maybe a very different but a very important way too. But maybe go into your background to some level of detail, because I think that's going to set the conversation for a very interesting half hour.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. So I am a retired, but more like transitioned career intelligence professional. I did about 25 years active duty Army intelligence. I was started out as a tactical intelligence officer, but never held a tactical job. Always looking at strategic national security events and threats, and all the way from the beginning of my career when I was just a baby little butter bar, a lieutenant. And I've had jobs in intelligence roles, all different kinds. I've done human intelligence, I've done signals intelligence, I've worked in geospatial intelligence. But my specialty, my personal love is intelligence analysis of multidisciplinary intelligence. So I did that for 22 years, the pinnacle of my career. I was selected to be Barack Obama's daily intelligence briefer, which was a great job, exhausting, but a great job. And also I was in that same role, the executive coordinator of the president's daily intelligence brief. So that meant my role was to coordinate, gather, collect, and synchronize all of the intelligence reports that all the 17 agencies of the intelligence community thought were important and thought that the president should see. So I look at all of those. I would determine what should be in the book and what could wait for another book or a later presentation, harmonize the messages from all the agencies, and present that to the president and his chief of staff, Jack Lew. So that was a really great role. I loved it. I did that for a little over a year in 2012 during an election year, which was also very challenging. And from there, that launched my career in consulting in geopolitics. Yeah, so that's pretty much my background. Anything specific that you might want to delve in or ask me about?
So maybe a couple things, starting with a little bit of the mundane or less so about security clearances. And this must be part of how you roll throughout. I think you and I spoke. I think you have some today, probably not at the same level when you were briefing President Obama, probably maybe different than you're doing Army intelligence, but keeping secret doesn't seem to be the way politics rolls these days. But maybe talk about what you've seen in the evolution of security clearance and what it means to be maybe a practicing civilian today, for want of a better term, versus briefing a president or doing something around Army intelligence.
In my opinion, and in probably the opinions of the majority of security clearance holders, it is a privilege to have a security clearance. You have access to intelligence and information that the rest of the public does not have. And you are expected to treat that information and knowledge with the respect that it's due. And clearances are tiered and leveled. So there's secret clearances, top secret clearances. There are top secret with specially compartmented information, which is when you hear TS/SCI. There are many, many levels of clearances, and not everybody gets the same level of clearance. Pretty much anyone that joins the military or works in the government gets at least a national security trust. It's a basic background check, and they just make sure that you're not going to spill the beans about where you're deploying or when or any of that. And then it scales from there depending on what your job and your role is. Not everybody gets a TS/SCI clearance. Not everybody gets to see all the intelligence that's available. You really are responsible for just the things that you're working on. So if you're an Iraq analyst, you're going to get to see all the intelligence that deals with Iraq, but you shouldn't be looking at stuff that deals with North Korea unless there's some link between Iraq and North Korea. So that's how clearances work. There are very, very stringent procedures and regulations that govern who gets a clearance, who doesn't get a clearance, what happens if you lose your clearance. You can appeal and you can say, hey, that wasn't fair or whatever. But yeah, there are a lot of stringent rules and restrictions about having a clearance.
And maybe just sticking to your White House days too, this is interesting on a couple of different fronts. So we're going to talk about some of the risks in geopolitics as we get on in this conversation. And you'll probably have a different side of it. I'm saying, look at everything that's going on now. I think perhaps maybe some of those threats were seen and maybe not acted upon. So when it comes to maybe something as simple as giving a daily briefing, I don't know how much of a window you had, but a president is a very, very busy person. How do you distill down this information into a 10 or a 15-minute window and put the right perspective? Because I think you've got a sovereign that's reacting and conducting themselves based on that briefing. So it is critically important. And to some extent, you have to get it right in a very narrow window of time.
Well, you're absolutely right. And the process and procedure has been refined over decades. In terms of distilling and the digest for the president, that one's not as hard as it seems because the president gives you basically his PIRs, his priority intelligence requirements. And he says, these are the 10 things that keep me up at night. You better make sure that if anything happens, I know about it, about these 10 things, whether that's North Korean nuclear capabilities, whether it's Iranian nuclear capabilities, what Russia's doing, whatever it is, he's got a list. And that comes out of what we call the NIPIF, which is the National Intelligence Priorities Framework. Now, you see every year the president publishes a national security strategy from which the national military strategy comes, the national intelligence estimates, all of those things. And from there, you can divine what the president's top priorities are and the things that he cares about. So it's really not that hard to distill or figure out what you should be presenting. But the tough part is taking all of that information and all of that intelligence, which is collected, analyzed, processed, and produced from 17 different intelligence agencies, harmonizing that, getting the main points from each one, and making sure that all of those are included in the briefing, which can only have 3 to 6 little articles in it, and then maybe 1 page of current events. That part is tough. And you got to fit pictures and data and maps and all of that stuff in there. So that's the part I think that's a little bit tricky.
So you would come out of that daily briefing and almost that very next minute start preparing for the one tomorrow? It seems like it's a never-ending process.
Correct. It is, because when you finish briefing the president, you have to take back, we used to call it carry the water. This is what he asked about. This is what he said. He thought this piece was really good. This piece was very thin gruel. He's used that phrase before. And a lot of times, if you don't get to actually see the president, you would leave the book with him, he would read it, and then he would write his comments in it and give it back to you. And you would go back to the agency and you would say, look, the president wants more information on Chinese counter space operations or this or that or whatever. And then you would task that out to the right appropriate agency and expert to deliver that presentation to the president.
So before we leave this, maybe a little bit as a fun side note, you told me you've been on Air Force One. I assume probably many times or at least more than once. And I saw Air Force One when Obama was president fly over Cape Cod at a very low altitude. And Obama used to vacation with his family on Martha's Vineyard. And just seeing the majesty of that plane. And I remember it was very low in the sky because it was landing at a local Air Force base. And it felt like if I had a baseball, I could have hit it. But I didn't hear it at all until it was past me. And it was flying so slowly. So there's just something about maybe the accompaniment of being the commander-in-chief of the United States. But what was that experience like, flying an Air Force One?
Well, the first time was mesmerizing, and you don't really get a grasp of how big it really is until you actually climb up the stairs and go in. It's like a hotel, actually. It's like a 3-level hotel. So at the very front, you have obviously the pilots, but then one level below them, there's all sorts of machinery, faxes and printers and computers and whiz-bang stuff. And then the president has his own bedroom and bathroom and his own little study. We have a little mini hospital on there. It's like a little clinic. I wouldn't say like a hospital. And then there's a giant meeting room or conference room. And then you have the part where what we used to call the strap hangers, people like me, the staff would sit in the middle of the plane, and there were a couple of tables and things, and we would play cards or talk about, mostly it was a lot of campaigning during 2012. So a lot of campaign trips. So we would be talking about that. The kids had flown a couple of times. Michelle had been on the plane on a couple of trips that I was on. A lot of times senators or congresspeople will catch rides on the plane. So there's also 2 kitchens. And then in the way back is where the press sits, and the press wrangler and all of them. So there's a hierarchy. The closer you are to the front of the plane, the more important you are. The further back, the less important you are.
So the press are not sitting or lying in lie flat beds.
No, no, they're not. They have the most uncomfortable seats on the plane. It's like being on a regular plane, actually, for them. For the rest of us, it's pretty nice.
Well, I appreciate the side note. It's a good window into something most people don't get to experience. So maybe moving on to the world at large. As I said at the top of this discussion, Michelle, we are along geopolitical risk. And it used to be the U.S. was the dominant supreme power, and they had the will and the might to make people do X, Y, and Z. Not so much anymore. And we now have NATO turning 25, and maybe some of your views on that. And then BRICS seems to be the place to be in terms of world population, and a lot of the Middle Eastern countries, which smaller GDP, but transitioning their economies, the likes of Saudi and the UAE, coming into BRICS as well, which already had countries like Russia, India, and China. So interesting dynamics going on. And we could talk about some of the more specific observations, but maybe your views about the current alliances. And I think NATO is probably less economic and more protecting. And then maybe the BRICS is economic, but these alliances can shift given whatever is going on in the wind. So maybe your views on that at large.
So this is a really important dynamic in the international relations theory and geopolitical scholarship. The idea of these alliances, whether they be military, security, defense alliances, whether they're economic alliances, whether they're ideological alliances. We have this trade agreement, USMCA, which is primarily an economic alliance. However, Mexico is now intending to join BRICS. So as we are transitioning away from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, the distinctions between alliances and whether or not they're economic or whether they're security, what they are, is really blurring. And it's very difficult to keep up with who's on whose side. We were quite shocked and surprised, but it was very telling after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which countries called out Putin and which countries didn't, which ones stayed silent, and then which ones were pro-Russia. So I think that gives us a sense of, and I don't want to call it chaos, but we're losing the order that we used to have. It's not quite entropy or anything. We haven't gotten to chaos, but the systems that we have grown dependent on are breaking down, and they're crumbling much faster than we expected. And it's just really hard to keep up.
And if you look at the collective hotspots, Michelle, you've looked at this a long time. Is my observation that this map is flashing more red than ever? Is that correct? Or are you just saying, hey, you have to look over long periods of time and these things like markets go up and down?
I do 100% think it's cyclical. Yes, it's flashing red. But if we were 8 or 9 years old back in the early 80s, we would have been doing duck and cover drills, convinced that the Russians were going to launch a nuclear weapon at the United States and destroy the whole United States. We went to war in Vietnam to prevent the Soviets from gaining a foothold there because we felt always under threat by the Soviets, by their ideology, by the size of their military arsenal. So I think, yes, it's flashing red, but it has been this way in the past. I just think that everything is cyclical. And the reason it feels so terrifying and out of control right now is because we are interconnected in a way we've never been in the past. The war in Ukraine is in your bedroom at night when you're watching the news. That didn't happen in the 80s. We just didn't have CNN and 24-hour coverage or any of the abilities or technologies that we have today that really launch us right into the heart of the conflicts. And so I think that, yes, conflict is cyclical. And from a purely academic perspective, conflict is a continuum. On the left-hand side, we're total peace and everybody's happy and we have alliances and trade alliances and globalization is making everyone happy and the rising tide that's lifting all the boats. And on the right-hand side, we have complete and total discord, which becomes conflict. And we constantly are moving on that continuum, left to right, back and forth, from cooperation to competition to conflict. And so I think right now we see conflict everywhere because that's the lens that we're using. But if we chose to use a different lens, I'm not sure economically, if we chose to look at it from an economic perspective or from a social perspective or a science perspective, if it would feel so terrifying.
And there's a lot of things going on too in the world. And you mentioned a few of them in terms of globalization and trying to marry that up against post-COVID. Everybody's trying to nearshore and onshore supply chains. So nationalism is coming into the hold. But then if you think about demographics, most of the younger population is in places where the large GDP holders are not. So we need more cooperation there, solving for climate as well. Maybe I'm hopeful or thinking we've got to get through this season of discord, but we probably, to have a functioning global economy, we need more globalization. We need more cooperation. Is that the right way to look at this? And if it is, how do we get from this tenuous point in February of 2024 to the promised land on the other side?
Well, I got to say, if I had the answer to that, I would probably be a very wealthy
Nobel Peace Prize winner.
yes, a wealthy person and a Nobel Peace Prize winner. However, I do think that is one way of looking at it. And I try not to say that's the right way to look at it or the wrong way to look at it. It is a perspective, and I happen to share that perspective. I do believe that being more globalized and interconnected actually benefits us all economically and socially in terms of security and really all different ways. The way I look at it is even in your neighborhood. Trying to have friendly relations with your neighbors, whether or not you agree with them on everything or not, makes for a much better life for everybody. If you can get along with your neighbors and you can agree on the essential things that affect everybody. Okay, we're not going to drive 50 miles an hour down our street, and we're going to make sure that the kids are okay, and we're going to be respectful. And I think when we do that and we try to ensure that everybody has their main needs met, that it works better. And so I do believe that globalization was intended to be the rising tide that lifts all boats. It did not necessarily work out that way, but almost 100% of the participants are better off now than they were before we instituted globalization.
I don't know what the big alliances are, but if it's NATO and BRICS, does there eventually have to be some MOU between those two to get to this point of globalization?
No, I don't think so. What I do think is happening is that the multilateral institutions that are responsible for stewarding and shepherding, enforcing those agreements and alliances and treaties, those are becoming increasingly feckless. They have very little power. It's really just them now supplicating and begging for member nations to stick to the agreements. Just recently, we saw with the UN in Israel, no one's listening. No one is listening anymore. The South Africans brought a really good, really well-built and well-argued case, and it basically got 2 or 3 days in the news cycle, and then nobody knows what happened. Where is it now? Is it gaining traction? When will it be heard? So I think institutions like the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the ICJ, all of these, even NATO, they're increasingly unimportant to what's happening in the world. And I think that is a problem. When you can't count on the UN, when you can't count on the World Health Organization, we couldn't count on them during the COVID crisis. They were just completely disorganized and provided no leadership. So if the United States is going to step back from its role as world policeman, somebody needs to, or something, some organization needs to step into the breach. And right now, I don't see that happening with any of the multilateral institutions.
And is it the U.S.'s choice to step down or step up, or is that not in their control as much as it was once, maybe back in your day in administration or maybe going further back?
It is our choice, but we are a politically divided nation. So if 50% plus one wants to do it, great. But if less than that want to do it, then we're not going to. The president has a huge amount of power with the executive orders. However, joining or leaving some of these institutions requires congressional approval, and we just can't get there.
And these are, as you alluded to, Michelle, long-term commitments. And if we're changing our approach, not even every 4 years, because leading up to elections, maybe the interim Congress has a different view in terms of how it's stacked. And I think that starting and stopping is just not productive to the very best long-term outcome.
No, and I think you're seeing that right now with Iran. Iran would have been a much more formidable ally for us in the Middle East and would have been more inclined to intercede if we hadn't broken our agreement with them. We basically made an agreement with them. They stuck to their end of the bargain and they carried out their part of the agreement, and we broke the agreement, even though they had done everything we asked them to. Now they don't trust us. And why should they? And this is really important. We're going to start to see this, I think, even more in the Pacific. Right now, was it last week or the week before? I've lost track of time, but Kim Jong-un came out and said, the United States is no longer our biggest enemy. Yay! Now it's South Korea. Boo! Because we have 35,000 troops on South Korea, it might as well just be the United States. So if we walked away from agreements and treaties like we did with Iran and former President Trump has threatened to do with NATO and with other alliances, who's going to trust us? Who is going to say, yes, I'll be there and I have your back and we will help protect your interests? So I think it's had a very deleterious impact on treaty building, alliance maintenance. And to be fair, I think a lot of people were very surprised when President Biden was able to get NATO to pony up and to reach across the Atlantic. I think a lot of people had really just written NATO off.
And I do wonder, too, I think there's definitely an intersection of economics and geopolitics. And we've got a Fed that thinks they can control interest rates and inflation. But then I look at what's going on in the Red Sea and how much of the goods that this world consumes passes through that tiny little sliver of water or sea of water. And I think that in and of itself could have a bigger impact on inflation. And then I look at the size of our national debt. Who's buying our paper? Does China stand down? Does Japan stand down? And in order to get somebody to buy, you have to offer a higher rate. So I do wonder the impact of all this geopolitical risk on the real economy. And does the Fed have the control that they once did on both inflation and long-term interest rates?
That's an excellent question. And full disclosure, I am not an economist, but I'm a hobby economist. I love, especially where it intersects with geopolitics. So before 2008 and before we introduced this crazy idea of quantitative easing, we could use models, and those models pretty much worked because we've been using them for decades and we understood how they worked. Once we injected all that money into the global economy, we had no idea what was going to happen. And we didn't remodel. We did not change. In fact, we still haven't changed the majority of the economic models to account for that and to account for tightening, loosening, any of those things. And now it's not just in the US, it's pretty much every major economy. So in terms of, do I think that the Fed, our Fed, or any central bank really has that much control anymore? No, I don't, because I think there are way too many factors that are out of control, wild cards, black swans, gray ducks, pink flamingos, whatever you want to call them, that are well beyond our control. That includes climate change, destruction from climate change, forced migration from climate change, the drought that caused the Panama Canal to turn away so many ships and force those ships to find alternate routes. All of these things, COVID, pandemics, the Fed does not have control over those. And most of the time, it's in a reactive mode. And you're just not going to be able to react fast enough in an economy of the size that we have for it to really have an impact and make a noticeable, substantial change that we can feel and see in a time frame that is less than, let's say, I don't know, probably 6 months to a year.
And as a follow-up, Michelle, and you probably alluded to this, and maybe you've answered it already to some degree, but we're bringing in geopolitical risk into the Kaya curriculum for the very first time. I think we've had some articles about it, but it's now going to be an integrated part of the curriculum. And if I think about various types of managers, a manager focused on relative value, something that may be mispriced in emerging market A, and I get that exposure in a different market at a better price, or a global macro manager that's looking at all of this contagion of events out there, and they can certainly make some alpha hay out of that. But one of the criticisms, or maybe observations, because I think it is real, very hard to model geopolitical risk. And I don't know if you've come up with the very best mousetrap here, but to say, well, it's hard to model, so I'm not going to worry about it, I think maybe you have a blind spot in your investment thesis. So how should a smart manager be thinking about this from an investing standpoint? And I know you're not an economist, not an investor either, but you know this risk and how perhaps they should be giving it some thought or not.
So I don't know how investors should be doing it, but I can tell you how I look at it. I have a couple of frameworks that help me. I don't want to say see the future, but I look at it like a hot air balloon. Sometimes you need to adjust the ballast and get a more strategic view, see around the corner, over the mountain, whatever you want to call it. And sometimes you really need to get really low and look tactically at the space that you are investing in, you're examining. So whether that's two really good tactical moves, I think right now are minerals, commodities, minerals that are required for the green transition. That's something you want to really get down and dirty and look at very closely, because you can see some patterns emerging. You can see some trends and relationships when you get down and look at it very closely. And you can forecast an array or a spectrum of scenarios that could evolve from that. And then you can assign a probability to that. There's no right or wrong answer in a probability. It's beta. Somebody said, this is the beta. We looked at all of these other companies, we did our comps and whatever, and this is the number we came up with. It's the same thing when you're looking at geopolitical risk or you're looking at the spectrum of outcomes and assigning a confidence indicator to it. The other thing that I do is I use the PESTLE framework to develop, and PESTLE is political, economic, social, technology, legal, and environmental considerations. It's a framework. And then I overlay that, much like I did in military intelligence, I overlay that on instead of the battlefield, the investment landscape. And I look for indications and warnings, just like if this was a map, just like if I were a lieutenant and I was advising an infantry officer or commander who was getting ready to launch an assault or an attack across this battlefield and go plant the flag on the hill, take the hill and plant the flag. There are a lot of things that can slow him down across the battlefield. There are a lot of things he needs to avoid. You can go around a lake, but you can't go around a river. You got to figure out how to cross that. And those things put you in more danger or less danger. So if you're stopping to do a river crossing and do all those things, while you're doing that, your risk is higher. Once you've crossed the river, you're now 2/3 of the way across. You have momentum, so your risk goes down. I do the same thing for my investor clients and even for my corporate clients. I look at the politics, the economics, all of those things, the social situations for whatever it is, whatever decision they're trying to make, whether that be an investment decision, whether it be a cross-border transaction, whatever. I look at those things through the lens of the PESTLE. And then I say, okay, these are the indications to look for that are telling you that, yep, you're on the right track. Everything is going the way that you thought it was going to. So you can maybe even speed up. You can maybe even make more aggressive bets here or place some more aggressive, or in the same indications, look, these indications are saying we got this all wrong. We didn't think Russia was actually going to invade Ukraine. Now we think they are. So you need to make some changes. Otherwise, you're going to be caught out in the open. And you're going to be at that river crossing with no protection, with no reconnaissance and surveillance assets. So that's how I model it. I don't ever, and I never really have, because I've never had a lot of faith in these standard geopolitical models that people pay thousands of dollars a year for, because they're very old, they're not modern, and they're not adaptable and flexible for the way that today's actors act, which in my opinion is sometimes quite irrational and against their own best interests. I don't know if that answers your question or if it was just a long rambling answer.
No, it does. And I don't know anything about this PESTLE framework, but I will look. And when I publish this, Michelle, I'll put a link to that as well. I think that'll be a good frame of reference for the audience. So in the remaining minutes, something you just said, which is fighting today's fight with modern day tools. And if I think about maybe geopolitical threats and risks, in the good old days, it's hard to sneak up on somebody with a tank. You can hear them coming and they make a lot of noise. And now we've gone to unmanned drones. But if I'm thinking about inflicting the ultimate chaos on an economy, it can be done with a cyber tool and influencing an election, having deep fakes. And I think Twitter has a lot of anonymous actors and probably hobbyists on there. And I've resigned from the platform. I simply didn't think it was a productive use of my time, although I can see why it is to some people. But just seeing some of the things on Twitter that seem so real, but you knew they were fakes. So maybe your observations, and you were probably talking about this long before it was in the common vernacular, about the risks of cybersecurity, the risks of these deep fakes, and now with generative AI and the ability to recreate. I could not be talking to the real Michelle potentially here. I could be talking to somebody that you created because you had a client to go see. So where are we in this, and how do we fight this good fight?
Well, from a geopolitical standpoint, actually, it's no different. The tradecraft for this threat is the same for analyzing any threat that you have. And even cyber attacks, when we talk about the threat face or the threat surface, it's the same analysis that we do, that intelligence preparation of the battlefield. It's a digital battlefield rather than a terrain battlefield. You still will be looking for vulnerabilities to exploit, and they will still be looking for clues. But as an intelligence officer, or even just an intelligence civilian, a security professional or whatever, there are still ways that you can protect your networks, just like you can protect and defend physical property and physical military bases and our FOBs, our forward operating bases, all of those things. It's the same digitally. And there are clues that you can look for and indications and warnings like tripwires in your systems that get tripped when somebody digitally intrudes, when there are digital intrusions. But what you really have to have in order for that to be successful is you've got to have really smart people that are paying attention, that are well educated and trained in that job, in their intelligence identification, who come to work every day with the right gear and the right resources and the right mindset. And that is, in my opinion, what we don't have. So it's possible to protect yourself. And there already are watermarks for generative AI and a lot of different ways. And I think that blockchain is also going to be super helpful in identifying this, the difference between generative AI and the real person. But the thing that we really have to be worried about in terms of technologies and cyber attacks is by the end of this decade, by 2030, quantum is going to be completely online. And quantum, I'll just give one example. You will have the ability to simultaneously encrypt and decrypt. So the moment you're encrypting something, the Chinese are decrypting whatever it is that you encrypted. So we've got to figure out, we got to crack the code on how do we do that? How do we protect things digitally when we have the ability to encode and decode simultaneously?
Well, I think a good thing maybe for me in the industry, Michelle, is that the Full Employment Act is definitely in play for you and people of your background. So very much appreciate that. And certainly we're going to see you more and more on the circuit where Kaya travels. I see you talking at Talking Hedge with my friend Big Bo. That's an awesome platform. And I think we'll be bumping into each other quite a bit, which is a good thing. Because as investors, the concept of buying something cheap and selling it for more, that does not go out of style. But how you get from point A to point B is changing dramatically. And this type of input is very timely and very relevant. So thank you for all that you do. And thanks for taking the time to spend with me today on this platform.
Likewise, Bill. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Educational Alpha. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Learn more about the Kaya Association and subscribe to the show at kaya.org. That's CAIA.org. See you next time.